Well, I think first and foremost, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons to defend itself, to defend its security. And that, of course, you can trace the origins of that back to the Korean War, when the United States threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea. So obviously, this has been a program that has stretched out over decades. And I think at times the North Koreans were serious, at other times they weren't so serious. More recently, they have been serious. Beyond defending themselves, there may be other reasons why they have nuclear weapons. I mean, after all, their possession of these weapons is seen as a threat by countries around them, and they could use that to intimidate them. I guess it's possible, and it just depends on the circumstances. So, for example, when I was in the US government in the 1990s until 2002, the North Koreans were much less interested in nuclear weapons and much more interested in a better relationship with the United States. Today, I think the North Koreans their interest in nuclear weapons may be declining, but they still need them. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they may have had more interest in developing them. So it varies depending on the time period. Well, I think we've taken a good step in the past year with the freezing of North Korea's testing, its missile and nuclear testing. That slows technological development. But the next steps we have to take, of course, are much harder, and that involves stopping the production of nuclear weapons, stopping the production of missiles, and eventually rolling it back to the point where they don't have any of those capabilities anymore. And that, of course, if it happens, will take a long time. Well, I think overall, what they've done is very positive, very good thing. We've stopped the development of these threatening weapons. There have been problems with how the policies have been implemented. We've had trouble having real negotiations with the North Koreans to reach detailed agreements. Part of that is our fault. We weren't really prepared for that. Part of that is their fault. They don't really seem to be engaging in the kinds of detailed negotiations you need to have to reach denuclearization agreements. So overall, we've had a good year, but there are serious problems, and I don't know where that's going to go in the future. You know, it's an interesting question, and the problem right now is that the North Koreans are not engaging. It's not that the United States doesn't want to negotiate. The United States is trying to start negotiations, but the North Koreans are not responding. So I'm not sure there's a lot that can be done at this moment without them responding. And beyond that, if they do respond, and we have negotiations, I think we need to be realistic about what's achievable at the beginning of negotiations. People always want to achieve a lot more than what's realistic. And of course, they want the other side to give a lot, and they want to give a little in return. And it doesn't work that way. That's not what a negotiation is. So once we get into a negotiation, I think the big thing is we need to be realistic. Well, I guess it's almost 10 years ago, I and some friends who had real experience dealing with North Koreans were very frustrated by the media coverage, which tends to be very bad. It's very cartoonish. A lot of the commentary is by people who've never even met a North Korean. They don't know anything about North Korea, but they pontificate a lot. So we decided, well, let's start a website where we'll have people analyzing North Korea who actually know something, who have real world experience dealing with North Koreans. And that's what we've been doing for the past 10 years. That's a very good question. This is probably not the answer you want, but I'm not a big fan of think tanks.
Oh, okay. What are actually think tanks?
Well, yours excluded, of course.
Yeah.
When I talk about think tanks, let me explain what I mean. In Washington, there's this foreign policy establishment, which has certain ways of thinking. And it's like they all live in this bubble off from the real world. And so what I would say is, the reason why I said that to begin with is that on an issue like North Korea, people need to break out of that bubble. They need to think outside of the traditional ways of dealing with North Korea. One example is the President Trump's reaching out to Kim Jong-un. I'm not a big fan of President Trump. I think 99% of what he does I don't like. But on this issue, it was actually the right thing to do. And yet what you would have found if you go back and look at the press surrounding the Singapore summit and everything that happened before and after, 99% of the foreign policy establishment thought it was a bad idea. So that's what I mean by I'm not a big fan of think tanks. This is an issue that requires people to think differently from the way we've thought for the past 25 years, at least in Washington. I think it's good. It's a good thing to have. It's good for people who work on different issues, not just North Korea, but all sorts of different issues, to get together and meet each other, exchange ideas. So I think that's a good thing, as long as people don't expect too much to come out of it. It's not going to create peace in our time, but it's a useful thing to do.